Thank you, Maria. Yeah, as Maria mentioned, we at AJ don't shy away from difficult topics or themes, and this is part of the rationale why we chose the theme of this year's conference. As you all know, whether it's about election coverage, organized crime, or corruption, or the ongoing war in Ukraine or conflict, basically this endless cycle of crises have been all around us. And journalists are those who carry those stories back to their communities. Talking about trauma is not easy, as Martin and Nancy mentioned. We might start dark, but also would like to talk about the mental health of journalists and offer you some tips and guidance how to build resilience in your everyday reporting, in your newsrooms, and in your communities. So with today's event, we would like to start a conversation about how journalists could remain resilient when faced with this avalanche of bad news and catastrophic events and disastrous coverage. How can an understanding of trauma help foster empathy both within newsrooms and across borders? Can we promote a more compassionate media environment? And how journalists and media professionals can combat the negativity bias inherited in covering devastating events without undermining their mental health. Again, we hope and we brought very inspiring and interesting editors, journalists, psychologists, and trauma experts to help us answer those questions and to give you some insights from their practice and experience. And without further ado, I would like to welcome Gavin Rees to the stage. He's the Senior Advisor for Training and Innovation at the Dart Center for Trauma and Journalism, Europe. He's an experienced journalist, documentary filmmaker, and he has been working as a trainer and consultant to news organizations for years and has organized trainings and workshops in more than 25 countries. And now he will talk about how and why we should understand trauma in the craft of journalism.
Thanks so much. Oh, thanks so much. I'm just going to grab some water as I suddenly realised that my throat is a bit dry, which is not a trauma reaction. It is a stress reaction, however. Have you noticed when you have to get up and speak, you might have a dry throat? So the first thing I'd like to say is what an honour it is to be here with you, and particularly to be part in a kind of early on discussion about trauma awareness and what we need to think about as journalists. It's great to be here. It's my first time in Bulgaria, and I apologise for not coming earlier. That was clearly a mistake. It's lovely to be here. It's a kind of beautiful city. Unfortunately, I haven't got much time this trip, so I'm going to have to come back later on and explore the city in more detail. Can we have a quick show of hands, just so I'm kind of clear who's in the audience today? How many of you would describe yourselves as working journalists? If so, put your hands up. Great. Do we have any psychologists in the room? Yeah, a few psychologists. Brilliant. Do we? Yes. And there's a workshop tomorrow, I know. Any students? People who are students? Great. Brilliant. And of the people working in the media, how many people work primarily with words? Yeah. How many people primarily with pictures? Yes, great. So we have some image makers as well. Good. So as has been said, I work for the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma. And we've been going in different ways since 1999. And I first started working with the Dart Center in about 2005 when I was working on a film for the BBC that was looking at what happened to the citizens of Hiroshima. And when I started working for the Dart Centre a bit later on, I also began to do research into what people were taught and trained about when they were at journalism school. So how many of the people in this room has had some practical, technical training in how to interview survivors of trauma? There's Dart people, a few other people as well. Good. So one of the things that came out of that research is that in the past, people just weren't prepared at all. They weren't given any kind of training, effectively, for having these kinds of difficult conversations where you're arriving in other people's grief. So I just want to kind of give you a quick example. There was a story that's been published in the New York Times a few days ago. And the reason I'm bringing it to your attention is that my colleagues shared it. So I had lots of emails flying around, and people said, you have to read this. And what it is, it's a piece by a journalist called Elie Saskal. Now, Elie has, in previous years, won Dart Centre awards for his coverage. And the story he's focusing on, which you may have heard of, is the story of the Clark family. And in August last year, an 11-year-old boy, their son, Aidan Clark, died in a bus crash. What happened is that a car veered across the road, a small van, hit the bus, and the bus fell over. And the reason that this is a story now, and it's so kind of consequential at this time, and also it's a story that illustrates lots of very important themes that we need to think about when we're thinking about trauma-informed journalism, is that this story has been blown out of all proportion and become a kind of extraordinary storm on social media, just at this moment now in the election cycle in the United States. And so the driver who hit the bus was a Haitian immigrant. He was legally in the United States. But then an enormous storm developed on Twitter in which far-right supremacist groups were claiming that this guy was part of a group of bloodthirsty criminals that had come across the border. It was weaponized by right-wing politicians. And then the father, Aidan's father, Nathaniel, decided to do a press conference in which he begged the media, begged, in particular politicians rather than the media, to not use his family's grief as a pretext for their own potential political gain. And the reason why, if you have a chance to look up the story, I'd really recommend it, is how beautifully and carefully it's told. So thinking about the journalist and the photographer who approached this family, there's the whole question about how do you build rapport with somebody in that extraordinary position of threat. So the family had received death threats from white supremacists, and they had to have a police guard because they were accused of betraying white people by begging the media not to make this into a race story. So that's the kind of context of what happened. So you have to kind of build rapport and sit with the family and understand what to ask, how to ask questions. And you also have to think about what's the impact of the news and how you tell this story on this kind of extraordinary whirlwind of kind of poorly connected, badly thought out, not properly described emotional content that's kind of flooding social media. And then you have to think about your own ethical responsibilities. Now, I'm not saying that, obviously, the Dart Centre didn't write this piece. I'm not claiming that the Dart Centre had a direct role in writing this piece, but it's very interesting, if you look back at the history of the last 20 years of journalism, how much better lots of reporting has got into kind of attending to the kind of emotional details, the things that affect families when they're in the kind of extreme moments. And so the other thing to say about this is that if you kind of go back and think about everything that's changed, if I was to kind of fly back 20 years ago, when I was doing research into how people are taught to interview people who've experienced trauma, the kind of classic idea was that journalists are somehow unaffected by the material that they're working with. That we're supposed to go out into the world, sit opposite a grieving family member. And by the way, Elie Sesko's story is so beautifully described. His mother, Danielle, describes that she doesn't grieve every day, she grieves with every breath. And so that sense of the kind of physical pain that she's experiencing as a mother through her loss is very kind of clearly captured in the article, but not in a kind of sensationalized way. But when we're sitting opposite people who have these huge emotions vibrating, resonant in them, are dealing with these kind of fundamental tragedies, we also absorb some of this emotional content. But the old ideology was that we were supposed to be like perfect recording machines, like kind of cameras that went out into the world. We saw terrible things, we heard terrible things. Often it's the verbal descriptions, it's the things that people tell us that have the most resonance. And somehow that information was supposed to go straight through us as journalists onto the paper without anyhow kind of touching the sides or affecting us. And that's pretty weird if you think about it, because also there's always been an understanding that emotionally vibrant news sells copy. So we know that there's emotions in the material, but somehow it wasn't supposed to affect us. And one of the reasons that happened, I think, is based partly on the desire just to sell newspapers, let's be honest. Let's just get the product out there and not worry too much about how the pizza is made. Let's just get it out there. But also part of it is about this idea of kind of objectivity that's kind of sort of a stupid idea, or like a stupid version of objectivity, is how I put it if I'm being polite. And that's the idea that emotional content, emotions, how we feel, are the enemy of objectivity. So if you feel something, that means that you're not being objective. And that's nonsense, because if you really want to understand the meaning of violence, the meaning of loss, the meaning of abuse, then you have to feel something. You have to kind of understand the impact of the story in order to be able to do it justice. So kind of trauma reporting is about understanding how people are affected by trauma. It's about understanding how individuals are changed by violence, abuse, and neglect. And it's also about understanding what the consequences of those stories are for society and how we kind of manage these things. What do people in public need to know about violence, its causes, and also about resilience and recovery in order to make the most consequential decisions that our societies face as democracies. So it's a fundamental, it's the most, in some ways, the most consequential and fundamental thing we can think about. And at the same time, as Boriana said, we often individually feel so overwhelmed by these stories that we may turn away from them. It may be too much, we can't see clearly, we have difficulty absorbing the content. If we're not careful, we may also write these stories up in a way that are so colourful, so full of raw, unprocessed, unmediated emotion, that we overpower our audiences. And they can't absorb the material either. They need to switch off, turn off, get away from the news. The moment news avoidance is a big thing. And so the kind of question for us, actually, is very much about how much are we noticing? How much are we noticing the impact that trauma has on us? How much are we noticing the impact that trauma has on the people that we're working with? How much are we noticing, even these small, subtle changes, how much are we noticing the impact that these stories are having on audiences? And the reason we need to understand these things, and very often this isn't a conversation about whether or not people have psychological injury or whether or not people develop post-traumatic stress disorder. This is often very much a conversation about these little tiny things, these little kind of small things that might creep into our reporting and our perspective and might affect the way that we're interviewing people, that we won't notice unless we've had a bit of kind of formal education and a bit of space to really think about what we're doing and to really understand the full complexity of covering violence. And so one of the funny things, or interesting things, if you like, about the Dart Centre as a network, so what we are is we're a kind of global network of journalists and filmmakers and psychologists who all think that we really need to pay attention to this stuff and to kind of stop and think and develop craft strategies and tactics for working on these very, very kind of complicated stories. But originally, the Dart Centre was born out of a very peculiar kind of loneliness. It was the loneliness of individual reporters and photographers and journalists who went into the field and who realized that they'd never really had a conversation about what it takes to do this kind of emotionally intense work before with their colleagues. And they felt that they shouldn't be affected. They felt that there was no space for their own reactions, that their own reactions would somehow pollute the story, that it was unprofessional to feel stuff, that it was unprofessional at times not to know what to say, not to know how to cover something. And so they didn't talk to each other about these things. And they stuffed all these issues into the cupboard. And so what the Dart Centre has tried to do, and also what we're trying to do here, is to provide a forum and a space and a network where we can exchange ideas, where we can develop strategies, where we can recognize impact. Sometimes it's big impact. Sometimes journalists are in situations in which they're threatened or intimidated, or they're working on content that is so, so hard to absorb that they do become, psychologically affected in a way that impairs their functioning. But a lot of the time, as I've already said, we talk about tiny little subtle things that we need to think about. I've been working quite a lot recently with journalists in Ukraine, and particularly trying to support groups of journalists who are covering profound human rights abuses. So journalists who are covering torture, conflict-related sexual violence, and they're doing masses of interviews. And these journalists weren't beginners. Okay? They really weren't beginners. They're very highly professional experts that had been covering the impact of Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine from 2014. They had lots and lots of experience. And what they became more involved with the Dart Centre after doing hundreds of interviews with survivors. And what they realized was that their existing toolkit had been largely predicated or based on the idea that they'd be interviewing politicians. So how do you adjust? How do you build trust with somebody who's had power and control taken away from them? How do you find a way of interviewing, of asking questions to somebody who's been tortured that doesn't make you sound like an interrogator? That doesn't assume that we as journalists have the right to information, but gives people choice and options and finds a way of making the people that we're talking to feeling stable. So there are little extra things that need to be added to the toolkit. And this is kind of fundamentally trauma awareness. We need to understand how people are affected by violence in order to find an effective way of approaching them and understanding how to have these conversations. The other thing that they've discovered also is this thing that we've already talked about a little bit, is that when you build connection with people, their emotions tend to come across that bridge of empathy. And we absorb material, ideas, emotions, pictures in our heads, experiences from the conversations that we have with people. And one of the things that the journalists I've been working with in Ukraine have discovered is that in order to do the right thing for the people that we're talking to, it's incredibly important that we take our self-care seriously. Because in other words, it's when we get exhausted, burnt out, jaded, have so much difficulty with the material that we're trying to push it away, that we're likely to say the wrong thing in an interview. We're likely to turn up in an interview without the full capacity to hear what the other person is saying. So these things are all connected. So self-care, I think I'm probably running out of time, if that's... yeah. So I'm going to come to an end and just say that our self-care is an obligation that we owe ourselves, because funnily enough, we're also human beings and we have value and importance in the world. But also it's fundamentally something that we owe both our sources, the people that we're talking to, and also our audiences. So if we get burnt out, jaded, overwhelmed by material, then we can't tell these consequential stories anymore. And that's a form of censorship. It's a kind of censorship that we don't think about very much. It's also one of the reasons, and we're going to talk about this afternoon, is why trolls, online harassers, political operatives of all different kinds, and criminals love hurling abuse at people on social media. It's an attempt to kind of silence us. And so it's fundamental that we have these conversations together and think about strategies and tactics and practical things that we can do. Even if they're tiny things, they're really, really valuable. It's really important, actually. Something we'll talk about in a workshop tomorrow, in order to look after ourselves and preserve our reporting. And so thank you for coming here. And I really look forward to talking to you. You can catch me if you see me in the break or wherever, and discussing things with you more over today. Thanks, Sam.